The 1987 to 1993 Cadillac Allante. Perhaps no other Cadillac in history has captured so much controversy as the Allante. Well, maybe aside from the Cimarron, but the Allante at least is probably a close second. In any case, the Allante was launched in 1987 as Cadillac was trying to push itself upmarket and compete with Mercedes and Jaguar in this high-end luxury convertible crowd. The car debuted for the 1987 model year with a base price of $54,700, the equivalent of $151,000 base price in today's dollars. Needless to say, that was not only an astronomical price, but also highly aspirational, as Cadillac hadn't really competed in this stratosphere since the 1930s when the Cadillac V16s as well as V12s were out in the marketplace. But in a vein somewhat similar to the current-day Celestiq, Cadillac wanted to prove that it could participate in this upper end of the marketplace, and the Allante was just the vehicle to do that. There's so much to be said about the Allante's design, and in fact, here on this channel, we have 2 interviews with Cadillac designers from the era, both Wayne Cady as well as John Manoogian, talking about the Allante program. Be sure to check those out. I'll put the links in the comment section. But there are so many things that we could talk about with respect to the Allante. Everything from this being the first time General Motors employed the quote-unquote world's longest assembly line, where the bodies were produced by Pininfarina in Italy and then flown over on 747s to be trucked to the Detroit Hamtramck Assembly Center for final assembly, to some of the interesting engines under hood. Yes, the Allante had Cadillac's 4.1, 4.5-liter V8s in its early years all the way through 1992 under hood, but they did have a unique to the Allante fuel injection setup as well as intake setup that endowed the 4.1-liter V8 with 170 horsepower compared to about 130, 135 horsepower in the normal Cadillac DeVilles, and the 4.5 liters with 200 horsepower compared to 155 horsepower in the regular DeVilles at the same time as well. When the Northstar was introduced for the Allante in 1993, that was the only model year Allante to get the Northstar, and it was the final year for the Allante, unfortunately, but it did finally get something touching near 300 horsepower in that year, and perhaps that's what it really deserved from the beginning. The Allante had many issues associated with it, most notably the largely manual folding top that, aside from being manual, was just extremely hard to figure out. It was designed by Pininfarina, and well, let's just say that Pininfarina had different standards for what constituted an excellently engineered top at the time, because their measure of whether or not a car is high quality is, does it go like stink, does it sound good, and does it look good, not does it necessarily function all that well. And that was proven out in the Allante, and I think the top went through at least 2 different redesigns over the course of the Allante's lifetime. But we're going to focus on something else with respect to the Allante in this video, and that is a crazy, crazy interior. Now, there are interiors like the Pontiac 6000s of the era where there are buttons all over the place and they kind of have a spaceshipy feel. But there's really not another interior that takes the buttons, at least in my mind, to the level of the Allante in modern history. Take a look at this photo of the dash of the Allante, and you can see there's a whole tower of buttons. Take a look at the center stack here in this photo, and you can see at the top there are the climate control buttons. Then beneath that, there's a trip computer with various functions. Beneath that is then the stereo, and in this particular case, a cassette player, or later, a CD player. So tons of buttons on the center stack. To complement, more buttons on the instrument panel. Notice that there are buttons for the headlamp controls, buttons for the mirror controls, and buttons for the windshield washer, wiper, etc. controls too. And of course, you've got the cruise control functions on the steering wheel. So buttons were everywhere, and I haven't even counted the power window switches or power door lock switches that are on the door panels in the Allante. Nor have I talked yet about even more buttons that were on the seats themselves. Take a look at the row of buttons here on these Recaro seats. Yes, the Allante did have Recaro seats from 1987 to 1992, and then they cheaped out for the 1993 model year, probably to help pay for the North Star. So you not only had the center stack buttons, the power window and lock buttons on the door panel, the wiper controls, the headlamp controls on the instrument cluster, but you also had an array of seating adjustments, far more than the typical six-way adjusters that you would see in many different vehicles of the time frame. And there were even a few more buttons that helped release the convertible top mechanisms and operate it that aren't shown in this particular photo. Now, to complement all the buttons, the Allante had a really interesting digital instrument cluster. You can see there two digital round dials, the left being a tachometer, the right being a speedometer. And they would respond in real time and actually were quite effective. Off to the right of the speedometer are three gauges, the oil pressure, engine temperature, as well as a fuel gauge. And then, of course, above those, you've got the trip odometer function. So not only did you have rows and rows of buttons, but you also had this futuristic digital dash to look at your speed as well as understand the engine speed as you were driving down the road. Beginning in 1988, an analog instrument cluster was offered for those individuals who just really didn't want to stare at a digital screen. And you can see it had a similar theme, two round dials, tachometer on the left, speedometer on the right. Although it did have four gauges here, an oil pressure gauge, a temperature gauge, a fuel gauge, as well as a voltmeter, which was not part of the gauges on the digital instrument cluster. Some people like this analog layout better than the digital. If I'm going to get an Allante, I would generally get the digital cluster. Well, maybe not, because they tended to fail, and it's probably really hard to repair those these days. But aside from the durability of the digital gauge cluster, I would have selected that one. I think it just goes more with the vehicle. So buttons, buttons, buttons was really the theme of the Allante interior. And I suppose that was in keeping with the high-tech theme that a number of automakers were trying to get into their interiors during this time period. But there is something extremely interesting about this production interior, especially when you contrast it to the Cadillac Studios interior seating book for what they were developing, an alternative Allante proposal, which, by the way, was knowingly not going anywhere. Cadillac had already signed on with Pininfarina to design the Allante, much to the chagrin of Cadillac Studios personnel. But let's take a look at Cadillac Interior Studios seating book. Now, what's amazing to me about this interior seating book that was done by the Cadillac design team as opposed to Pininfarina is that it is a model of simplicity. Look at how few buttons there are on this interior. In fact, it almost looks Spartan, I guess you could say. There's some buttons on the steering wheel there, just general controls. There's a very simple display right in front of the driver in between the steering wheel rim and the spokes that likely was quite legible. But there's no towering center stack with a bunch of buttons. There are a few buttons on this little, I guess you could call it console type thing. Not quite sure what those are for. I can't really make it out on the picture. But let's just say that this is a dramatic contrast to what was put into production on the Allante. And I also have to say that it appears strikingly similar to some interior designs today. Take a look, for instance, at the interior of this Tesla Model S Plaid. If you take away that big honkin' iPad type thing in the middle of the interior, I would say it actually looks pretty similar to what the Cadillac Studios had proposed back in the mid-1980s. So Tesla, perhaps, maybe they saw this Allante seating book, and that was the inspiration for their interior. I'm guessing not, but in any event, it just goes to show how far out into the future the Cadillac designers were thinking, although unfortunately their proposal was not the one that would be selected for this particular project. And as a result, instead of getting an interior that was the model of simplicity, customers instead got an interior that was filled with myriad buttons. And that's just what Cadillac, I suppose, decided in this case. And perhaps that's just one of the poor decisions that plagued the Allante throughout its production run and caused it to sell far below Cadillac's sales projections. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the crazy funky Allante interior. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.